Maseches Yevamos Daf Chaf Gimel is divided in half by a Mishnah. The first half of the Mishnah concludes the Gemara's discussion of Machlokes Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, and the Rabbanon as to how you learn the psukim describing the Yisur B'choso. The Gemara will go through each opinion and what they do with various psukim and how they each learn those limudim without those psukim. The Mishnah will then introduce the topic of somebody who marries one of two sisters and is not sure which one, a number of different cases on the subject, and how we work it out. So we're in the middle of a Machlokes Rabbi Yosef, Yehuda, and the Chachamim as to understanding the Isur Achosa. The Torah asks one to marry his sister, and there are two psukim describing it. The first one says, Eras Achoscha Bas Avicha Vasimecha, just describes one should not marry the sister who is the daughter of his father. The later pasuk says, Eras Bas Eishes Avicha, should not be together with the daughter of his father's wife. Now, how do you learn these two psukim together? So the Chachamim say there are two Isurim, and one could violate each one, or one could violate both of them together. So if one is together with his sister who is only the daughter of his father, but not his father's wife, that is, she was born out of wedlock from his father, that's one Isur. If somebody is together with a girl who is the daughter of his father and his father's wife, that is, she was born in wedlock to the father, then it's two Isurim, both the father and the father's wife's daughter, and therefore both are the sister. That's the Rabbanon's approach. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda learns differently. He says you can only violate one Isser. So what is the purpose of the second pasuk that describes the daughter of the wife? So the Gemara says that is to exclude one type of sister which is not Asr. And the Gemara is looking for what is that type of sister which is not Asr according to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara said that the first approach was that it excludes the daughter of the father who was born from a shifcha or from a goy. A shifcha or an ayvedes kechavim. There you have that is excluded. So the father gives birth to a girl from a shifcha or an avedes kechavim. That is not aser to the father's son. It's not a sister, even though they share the same father. It's not considered to be a sister, and it's not aser. So the Gemara says that is learned out from where it says eishes avicha. It's got to be that the only sister that's aser, someone who could be your father's wife. A shifcha and avedes kechavim can never be your father's wife. So the Gemara now wants to try. Maybe it's a number of other things. I didn't know that's what it means. So the Gemara first says maybe it's talking about where the father is together with a woman who's a chayvei lav, where there's an isser for him to marry that woman. Maybe that's who is excluded. So the Gemara says that Papa says that can't be, because you would never say that that's excluded by the requirement that the girl's mother be the father's wife, because that could be the father's wife. There is tfisas kedusha on a chayvei lav. If a man marries a mamzeres, he's not allowed to do that. It's a lav, but they're still considered married, and therefore saying that it has to be the father's wife's daughter does not exclude where the mother was a lav to the father. How do you know that there is tfisas kedusha on a lav? So the Gemara quotes a pasuk: "Hisiyana lish shtei nashim la'achas when a man has two wives, one is loved and one is hated, and it says there that they both get an equal inheritance for their children. So the Gemara says, why would I care which wife the husband likes better than the other? Why should it make a difference to the halacha as to what kind of inheritance they get? They are both wives, and the Torah doesn't hate them, Hashem doesn't hate them, so why should I care about the husband's preference? It must mean that one is part of a snua marriage, where one is, the marriage itself is something wrong with it, and that's a chayvei lav, and still it's saying that they're considered to be married, and they both have equal rights, even though one of them is a chayvei lav. So there you see that a chayvei lav does have tfisas kedusha, and that couldn't be excluded. So Mar says, okay, maybe it's to exclude chayvei krisis, where you have a situation where a man is together with a woman who is an Isser Karis to him, like his daughter or something like that, and then he has a son and a daughter, so he has a son maybe separately, but he has a daughter from that marriage. That son and the daughter are sister and brother, but there the Isser of sister doesn't apply because it's chayvei krisis. Maybe that's what's excluded from where it says Eishes, because there it can't be called Eishes. The girl's mother cannot be his wife. There's no tfisas kedushin on a chayvei karis. So the Gemara says, no, we have a specific drasha that includes that there is an Isser achoso. There is an Isser sister, even if the girl is born from a chayvei krisis to the father, and that's because the pasuk describing it says, Ervas achasich bas avicha ibasi mecha miled is bias or miled is chutz. Born in the house, born in, or born out. What does born in and born out mean? Whether it's born in a marriage that the father is allowed to keep, or it's born in a marriage or a relationship that the father has to send away. Either way, the Yisur Achosa does apply. So you see, even in something like chayvei krisis, where you have to send them away, still it counts as Yisur sister. So the Gemara says, well, maybe that's talking about an avedes kechavim and a shivcha that he has to send away. How do you know that that's talking about a chayvei krisis? So the Gemara says, no, avedes kechavim and shivcha is included from the fact that it says that it's only aser. That is, avedes kechavim and shivcha are excluded. There is no Yisur Achosa on that, on a sister produced from that relationship, because the Torah said it has to be eishes, it has to be a wife. Someone says, okay, so you have one inclusory pasuk, one exclusory pasuk. You have moledas chutz, that even someone who the father can't stay married to still gives birth to a sister, that's asur, and yet it says that it has to be a wife, so it says that it has to be somebody that he could stay married to. So one, you have to include one and exclude one. How do you know which one to include or which one to exclude? So Gemara says, well, obviously we're going to include the chayve krisus, and we're going to exclude the Avedas Kechavim and the Shivcha, because the Avedas Kechavim and the Shivcha are usher to all Jews. The Chayve Krisis is only usher to this man, so I'd rather include the one that is more mutter. So I'm going to include the one that's just a Chayve Krisis and exclude the one that is Avedas Kechavim. So the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you an opposite svara. The Avedas Kechavim and the Shivcha could be converted. They could be freed, they could be converted, and could be therefore mutter to this man himself. They have a potential heter to this person. Chayve Karis never has that, so therefore maybe there's more of a reason to include the Chayve. There's more of a reason to include the Avedas Kechavim and the Shevcha, and to exclude the Chayve Krisus. Says the Gemara, no, when she converts or is free, that is a new person. That is considered like a new person that's born. It's not considered the same individual, so there is no heter to that original Shevcha or Avedas Kechavim. She could change into somebody else, that would be a heter, but that's not a reason why she should be included more than a Chayve Krisus. The Gemara says, okay, so now we understand, according to Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, what this pasuk of Eishes Avicha is for. It's to include an Avedas Kechavim and a Shevcha. According to the Rabbanon, how do you know Avedas Kechavim and a Shevcha? How do you know that their daughter is excluded from the Isser Achoso? So the Gemara answers, it's learned from the fact that it says, Ha'isha v'yoladeha tiyal adoneha, when discussing a Shevcha, it says that the Shevcha's children belong to the master, the owner, and therefore they are not considered to be her own, and not Masiachas after her, and therefore her daughter could not be a sister of the son of her husband. So that's why they are excluded from there. So the Gemara says, why doesn't Rabbi Yosef Yehuda learn from there? The Gemara says, yes, you could, but that's for a Shivcha. How do you know for an Avedas Kechavim? For that, you need the pasuk of Eishes Avicha. Now, why do I need both Shivcha and Avedas Kechavim? Both of them are Ovdei Kechavim, both of them are the Goyim, so why do you need two psukim for that? The Gemara says, if I only knew one, I would not know the other. If I only knew Shivcha, Shivcha is excluded because the Shivcha never has any ancestry. Shivcha is removed from all ancestry. There's a pasuk that we learn that drasha from. It says, Hadime lechamor, shvachos are considered like a chamor without ancestry. But about the akum, it says bladin ben bladin, hadrimon ben tavrimon. We see that there is ancestry for them. Now, about Avedas Kechavim, if I only knew that, I would not be able to learn from there to a shevcha, because a shevcha is chayiv in mitzvos, like an isha. So all avadim are chayiv in mitzvos as an isha. So I think that there is an isra achosa on her daughter. I would not be able to learn from an akum, just because an akum who's not shaykh in mitzvos, that's because her daughter does not have the isra achosa, does not mean that the shevcha does not have as well. Okay, so now we've separated between Shevcha and Avedas Kechavim. The problem is, now if we go back to the Rabbanon only had a source for Shevcha. Ha'isha v'yolodeh tiyal adoneh is only a source for Shevcha. How do they know Avedas Kechavim? And you can't tell me learn from each other, because we said you can't learn from the other. So Gemara says, Rabbanon learned from the fact that a Avedas Kechavim, the daughter of a Goy, is not Jewish at all. The rule is that Jewish ancestry goes through the mother, and therefore if the mother is an Avedas Kechavim, there's no Judaism there at all, and therefore certainly not considered to be a daughter as far as the Isser Chos is concerned. We learn that from the Torah describing the Isser into marriage. It says, Ki Yasser has been Chamei Achayrai. It says that if you will marry off your son, if you will marry off your daughter to a non-Jewish man, then he will turn away, it says the male version, Yasir, he will turn away your son from me. That means that this is your son who's considered your son, he's considered Jewish, but because his father is not Jewish, he will turn him away towards his Avodah Zarah. But it doesn't say Kisasir, it doesn't say that if the father's Jewish and the mother's not Jewish, it'll turn away the son, because that son's not Jewish anyway. And from there you see the source that Jewish inheritance, Jewish trait, ancestry goes through the mother and not to the father. Therefore, I don't need a source to exclude the daughter of Avedas Kechavim. She's not Jewish anyway. Now, that's a general rule which we've seen early in the Masechta, and we'll see it again later. So now the Gemara asks, this drasha is brought by Ravina. Do you mean to say that Ravina holds that the child of an Oved Kechavim or an Eved and a Jewish woman, that child is a kosher? You see from here that it's not a guy, and you also see that it's not a mamzer, because otherwise it would be chayvei lav. So do you want to say that he holds that it's a kosher? So Gemara says no. Just because it's not a mamzer and it's not a guy doesn't mean it's a kosher. It's still called a puzzle. Now the Gemara asks that this whole Kiyosir is only written about the Shiva Umos. It's only written about the 7 nations who lived in Eretz Yisrael before Klal Yisrael took it over. How do you know about other nations out there? So the Gemara says that it depends if you hold like Rabbi Shimon or not. Rabbi Shimon has a rule called the Dorish time of the crow. We understand the Torah's reasoning, and we don't need the Torah to tell me the reason if I could figure it out on my own. Therefore, this pasuk is talking about the 7 nations. When it goes ahead and it tells me the reason that it's also to marry them because if you have a Jewish grandchild from a non-Jewish father, he'll turn your son away. Why did the Torah have to tell me what the reason is? I know the reason on my own. That's called Derish time of the Krah. Rabbi Shimon holds I could figure out the reason on my own and apply the reason on my own. The fact that the Torah tells me the reason is extra words. It should not say Lo Yasir. It's coming to teach me that any time Lo Yasir applies, any situation in which the father is not Jewish, it could have the same problem of taking away the child from a Jewish observance, and therefore even other nations, you have the same fact that the transmission of Jewish traits goes through the mother and not through a non-Jewish mother. A non-Jewish mother would not give birth to a Jewish child. But that's only according to Rabbi Shimon, who holds that the phrase Lo Yasir is extra because I would know the reason on my own. According to other Shitos, how would you say that that's extra, and therefore how would I know by other nations? And therefore what would be the source for the Chachamim of the halacha that a sister born from an Ovedus Kachavim of other nations other than the 7 also does not have the Yisar Choso? So when it says you don't have to find anybody else, the Rabbanon here that we've been discussing all along is none other than Rabbi Shimon. That's the one who argues with Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore this works according to them. You don't have to go any further. And now the Gemara introduces the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens when a man marries one of 2 sisters and he doesn't know which one he married. Now, each of those 2 sisters is now a suffix. With relation to each one, he has to ask himself, is this my wife or is this my wife's sister? And therefore, I'm forbidden to this woman. So the Gemara will discuss his relationship with those 2 women. If he dies, what happens to them as far as Yibum? And what happens if there are 2 brothers that got themselves into this scenario? What happens as Yibum is concerned? The Mishnah will spell out a lot of the halachos, and the Gemara will describe why we need each one to be said. So our first set of cases is where you have one man who married one of 2 sisters. He doesn't know which one it is. So first of all, he is forbidden to both of them because each one may be the sister of his wife. Since each one might be the sister of his wife, he can't be with either of them. He has to give a divorce to both of them. Now, if he dies, so if he has one brother, so now that one brother, each of these 2 women might be his Yevama, but she also might be the sister of his Zekuka. Meaning, if the other sister is his Yevama, she's a Skuka, then this one that he wants to marry, or wants to do Yibum to, might be the sister of his Zekuka. He's also to the sister of his Zekuka, so therefore he has to do Chalitza. And once he does Chalitza to one of them, so if that was the one he was supposed to do Yibum to, and now he did Chalitza, so then the other one is Achos Chalutzaso. That's just like Achos Zekukaso is Aser. Achos Chalutzaso, the sister of one who did Chalitza to, is also Aser. Now, had it been that he did Chalitza to the woman that he wasn't related to at all, she was not the one who was married to his brother, then this one would be fine. It could do Yibum. However, we don't know that, and therefore we're concerned that both of them are Achos Chalutzaso, and therefore he has to do Chalitza to both of them. He can't marry either of them. Now, what happens if there are 2 brothers? So here the halacha is as follows. The first one has to do Chalitza. You can't have anyone do Yibum because it might be Achos Zekukaso. Somebody does Chalitza. Now, one of the sisters is Achos Chalutzaso. The one that he did Chalitza to, obviously you can't be together with, because you can't be together with your Chalutza, and she might be his Chalutza. On the other hand, the other sister is potentially Achos Chalutzaso, and he can't do Chalitza or Yibum to that one either. However, his brother now is allowed to. His brother is allowed to do Yibum, because the brother, if the woman that he's marrying is the original wife of the dead brother, so then he's doing Yibum, and that's fine. There's no problem. If it was not, so then she was originally Achos Zekukaso, but now that the other brother did Chalitza to the Skuka, Now that zika is broken, and this woman is not anything. She's a former achos zikukaso, but the zika is gone, and therefore the second brother is allowed to marry her. So therefore, in that case, the first brother has to do yibum, and the first brother, that is, has to do chalitza, but the second brother could do yibum, and there's no problem there. Now, what happens if you have two brothers, if you have two men that marry, that is, two unrelated men that marry two sisters, and neither one knows which one he married. So now, a lot of the same halachas apply, but there can be some halachas that are different, and the Mishnah will spell them out. So, of course, each one cannot be with either of the two women, because he does not know if each one is his wife or the sister of his wife. If they die, and each one has one brother, each one cannot do anything other than chalitza, because he doesn't know if the woman that's in front of him is his Yavam, which would have been okay, but it might be the sister of his Zekuka, which would be Aser. Once he does Chalitza, he now has a question of with respect to each woman, is this his Yavama, or is this Achos Chalutzaso, and therefore the second one is forbidden as well. He has to do Chalitza to both of them. Now, what happens if the two men who originally married the two sisters, and each one didn't know which one, what happens if one of them had one brother and one of them had two brothers? So the halacha of the one brother is the same. The halacha of the one who has two brothers, however, is as follows. As we said before, one of the brothers has to do chalitza, because we have to be concerned that both of these women are achos zikukaso. Once that brother does chalitza, so the other brother is allowed to do yibum for the same reason we said before. For each woman would be mutter to him. If it says Yevama, so then fine, no problem. She's his Yevama. She's not achos anything. If she's not his Yevama, so then she was achos zikukaso, but she's not achos zikukaso anymore, because the other woman got chalitza from the other brother, and therefore he's allowed to marry her. Now, the Gemara explains that this is all repeated because the chiddush over here is that we don't make Xera one brother up to two brothers. That is to say, the case where there is one, the one brother has to do chalitza to both of them. The two brothers, the second brother is allowed to marry one of the two after the first brother does chalitza. We might think we'll potentially be afraid that they'll get confused and end up both doing yibum, or that the case where there's only one brother will do yibum. We don't make such Xera, and we allow when there's two brothers, one of them to do yibum after the other one has done chalitza. Now, the Mishnah describes halacha in both of these cases. What happens if the two brothers both go and do yibum to the two sisters? So the Mishnah says that they're allowed to stay married, and that is for the following reason. The first one was not allowed to do what he did because he might be marrying achos zikukaso. However, once the second one did yibum, that zika is for sure gone. So therefore, it's okay either way. If the one he originally married was his yivama, fine, no problem. That yibum is done. The second sister is not a zikuka anymore. The second sister was never a zikuka, and she's free to marry the second brother. Now, if the original one was achos zikukaso, that was aser. But once the second brother married the zikuka, that was yibum, and the zika ended, and it's not achos zikukaso anymore, and they're allowed to stay married. Would not force either of them to leave. Now, the Mishnah that is now discusses what happens if both men who married the two sisters and didn't know which one was which, if both had two brothers. So they both died, and they both left two brothers. Now, each of these women is a suffix which of the two brothers she's falling to. So each of the two brothers has to wonder which of these two women is my yavam and which is achos zikukaso. So the halacha is as follows. One brother from each pair has to do chalitza. The second brother is allowed to marry the other woman, not the one who got chalitza from the brother. And the reason is as follows. Each brother, with regard to the woman that he's going to marry, if she was the one who was married to his dead brother, he's his yivimto, fine and no problem. She's not the sister of any zekuka. The other woman wasn't married to his brother at all. If, however, she is not his yivama, so then she was the yivama of the other brother. She was the Yevama of the other man and the other set of brothers, and she got chalitza from the other set of brothers because each one did a chalitza. So therefore, he's allowed to marry. Now, he's only allowed to marry the one of the two who got chalitza. So she got chalitza from one of the brothers there. So either she's his Yevama or she got chalitza from the other one. Either way, there's no zika, and she's allowed to marry him. There's also no Yevama l'shuk, because if she is his Yevama, fine. If she's not, then she was the other pair of brothers, zekuka, and she got chalitza from one of them, and therefore she's fine, she's free to go. Now, what happens if one pair of brothers get up without asking the halacha? They both do chalitza to both of these women. Now, both of them are asr because both of them may have made the woman to be his chalutza, and chalutza would be asr, and therefore these two are asr to both women. However, the other pair of brothers, so one has to do chalitza because one might be his yivama. The second one is allowed to do yibum because the second one, either it's the yivama to him, or it's the sister of the yivama who got chalitza from the other pair of brothers, and therefore everything is fine. Now, if they went and they married without asking, then of course everything's okay also, because if it's his Yevama, then each one, if he's married to his Yevama, that's fine. If not, then the Zika is broken by the Yibum being performed to the sister. It's not a Chos Zikukaso, because the other sister got her Yibum already, and that Zika is off. Okay, now the Gemara begins. First of all, the Gemara asks, isn't it a proof here that Kedushin She'ein Masurin L'Biyah is Kedushin? Kedushin She'ein Masurin L'Biyah means if you marry someone in a situation in which you can never be together with that person intimately because you don't know if it's your wife or not. So this person who originally married one of two sisters and didn't know which one, or considering him married to them, because we're saying he's also to the two of them and has to give a get, but he can never be with either one of them because either one are his potential wife's sister. So it's kedushin that can never be consummated. So it's a machlokes in a different mesechta whether that counts as a kedushin or not. So here you see a clear proof that it does count as kedushin. The Gemara says no, not necessarily. The case here was that at the time of kedushin he knew who he was giving to, and therefore the kedushin counted then because he knew who he was going to be married to. The situation here is where later something got confused, didn't know who the shliach was, or he forgot, and therefore he no longer knows which one he's married to. But at the time, the kedushin was chal. Now the Gemara explains that the chiddush of each of these, we're not just spelling out the calculations. First of all, that we have a chiddush here that you have to do chalitza before yibum, and you have two brothers. The chalitza has to go first in order to avoid achos zikukaso. When you have one brother, when you have two men who did yibum, and one has one brother, one has two brothers, like we said earlier, that's a chiddush, that you don't make gzeira, that the two will be confused with the one, and the one is aser, and the one has to do chalitza to both of them, but the two, one of them is allowed to do yibum, you don't mix those two up, and we allow that. When you have two brothers to each of the men, there we said he's allowed to do yibum after the other one does chalitza, after one of the other pair does chalitza. Versus you may think there's a gzeira, he may end up doing yibum before chalitza happens from the other pair. Coming to show you there's no gzeira in there. We allow him to do yibum after that chalitza. We don't make a gzeira. Now, the Gemara has a kasha that one of the cases in the Mishnah seems to be similar to a different case we learned elsewhere, but has a different halacha. We had the case where you have two sisters, each one's married to a man, and neither one knows which one they're married to. Each man has two brothers. They die and they fall to Yibum. So we had said that one of each pair of brothers has to do chalitza, and then the other one can marry, a brother from the other pair can marry the chalitza of this pair. Now, we have a different case, which is where you have four brothers and two sisters. The first two brothers are married to two sisters. So you got Reuven and Shimon married to sisters. Reuven and Shimon die, and those two women fall to Levi and Yehuda. Very similar case. You have two sisters falling to two men, and each one is an achos zikukaso, the sister of his zikuko, which was the entire problem here. But over there we say both have to do chalitza. We don't say that one could do chalitza and the other one could marry her. So what's the difference? Someone says, how can you compare the two? In this case, the second sister is not a skuka to the man who wants to do yibum. It's only one that's a zikuka. In the case you're asking from with the four brothers, the woman is zikuka. Each woman has a zika to both of them because they're brothers. They're all together. So let's go through it. In the case which we had once one of the brothers from one pair does chalitza to one of the women, that woman is now permitted to both brothers in the other pair. Why? Because if she was their dead brother's wife, so then she's the Yevamam, she's married to them. If she was not their brother's wife, then she was from the original parent. She got chalitza already, so she's free to go. There's no problem there, and she's not in achos zikukoso at all. She couldn't be in achos zikukoso. Even though her sister might have zika to one of the brothers that she's marrying, the other brother is going to do chalitza to her first, and therefore that achos zikukoso is off. There's no issue. Here in our case, each sister has a zika to both brothers. She's a yavam to each brother. Both women are falling to even to both brothers. She has a zika to both of them. Once there's a zika that's usser, that creates a permanent isser. Right? So in our case, we didn't know if she was a zika or not. We didn't know if she was a skuka or not. And she wouldn't have a zika. The only zika that she had was taken off by the chalitzas. Here, in our case, both brothers are her yevamos, and one of them is going to do chalitza. That does not change the fact that the sister had a zika, which was aser because she was an achos zikukoso, therefore she'll stay aser. For either of the two reasons which we have learned, that an achos zikukoso in that case is aser. One of the reasons might be, we saw two opinions. One was that we say yesh zika, and therefore they're considered to be a strong zika, and you can't get rid of that and it stays aser. The other opinion was that it's aser levatal mitzvah yibin, that if one of them will do yibam, then the other sister might never get a chance to do anything, because the second brother, so let's say if Levi does Yibam, then Yehuda might die before he does anything to the other sister, in which case that sister comes back to Yibam to Levi, and she's usher because she is the sister of Levi's new wife, and therefore we don't allow it. Either way, those two don't apply in this case, because if they're both women have a zika to Levi, and over here only one of them has a zika, we just don't know which one. The Gemara now discusses the case we were just speaking about when the two brothers did Yibam. The Gemara said that they can stay married. The Gemara says that's true even if they are Kohanim. And even though one of them is going to be marrying a Chalutza, and a Kohen is also to marry a Chalutza. So again, the case is you had two unrelated men who married two sisters, and they weren't sure which man married which woman. Then they both died, and both women fell to Yibam, each to a pair of brothers, but they did not know which woman fell to which pair. One pair of brothers got up and did chalitza to both women. So now, those two women, one of them is a chalutza, because she got chalitza from one of the men to whom she had a zika. The other one is nothing happened to her. Now, the other pair of brothers goes and they both do yibum. So one of them is marrying a woman that he had a zika to, who had no chalitza. The other one is marrying achos zikukaso, the sister of his zika, who had chalitza from a different man, because she had a zika to a different man as well. She had a zika she was achos zikukaso, and she herself had a zika to a different man, but she got chalitza from him. So now, if the first one to do was the yibum, that's no problem, because now the yibum was done. Her sister is no longer achos zikukaso, she's just a chalutza, and now that chalutza is marrying a kohen. If the other one was married first, if the first one was the achos zikukaso, so that was an isser of achos zikukaso, but that zika ends, and there's no longer any problem when the other brother goes and does yibam to her, and she's no longer a zika. Now, either way, somebody married a chalutza here, and the kohanim are not allowed to marry a chalutza. So the Gemara says she's allowed to stay married to him, because there's no isser, because the isser of a kohen marrying a chalutza is only d'Rabbanan. The oraisa, a kohen is not allowed to marry a gerusha, a divorced woman. He is allowed to marry a chalutza. It's d'Rabbanan that we said chalitza and divorce seem too similar, therefore it's usher. And in this case, it's a suffix, because we don't know which woman is the chalutza, and they did not make exera in a case of a suffix. The Gemara says, is it true? Are you sure that a chalutza is only also to a kohen midrabanan? I have a brayse that seems to tell me that it's learned out of a pasuk. The brayse says, in describing the isser of a kohen to marry a grusha, it says, Isha zanam chalala lo yikachu, ve'isha grusha me isha lo yikachu. The second, ve'isha, is to include a chalutza. So the Gemara says that's not a real drasha, it's just a support, it's just an asmachta, and therefore we stay with this halacha, it's only the rabbanan, and it's mutter in this case where it's a suffix.